Today we're talking about how flash affects the way your photos look and how to master the settings on your camera so you have total control to adjust and achieve the look you want for your image. I recently explained the principles of using off-camera flash. It was a tutorial within a tutorial, and even though I shot some images in order to demonstrate what I was explaining, it wasn't nearly as thorough as I wanted it to be. So I've gone and shot some more, and I tried to be more scientific about it to help you visualize the differences in camera settings and power output and flash position so you can see how this really works. For simplicity, we aren't talking about how to compose a shot or how to light a car or how to use light modifiers. We're just focusing on the camera and flash settings and how they affect your image. Our setup is using this Godox V1 speed light with the Godox X Pro trigger, and the trigger is mounted on the hot shoe mount on the camera. It's a basic setup, but I find it really convenient and pretty affordable. The only modifier we're using are these tiny barn doors which limit the light spill so the light stays on the subject and on the ground near the subject, and we also have the light mounted high up on a stand pointed down, which will also contain the light and keep it away from our background wall. For the subject, we have a car that is white, which is a very reflective and neutral color, and it will react pretty evenly when we hit it with light. So that's going to be a good visual indicator to show what the flash is doing. I have staged this shot with the flash to the left of the subject, making this off-camera flash. Off-camera flash means the flash is firing from a different perspective from where the camera is positioned. If we shot this with the flash on top of the camera, the shadows would mostly disappear. They would fall outside the sight line of the camera, as I've demonstrated in this shot. Everything looks flat, and when you think about the expression deer in the headlights, that is effectively describing on-camera flash. When we move the flash over to one side, the camera sees the full range of highlights and shadows. We get a sense that the subject has volume and shape, and as you can see, it's brighter because the flash can be closer to the subject, and we also have more options for modifying the light. If we compare no flash with on-camera flash with off-camera flash, it's pretty clear which is more interesting and more impactful. I'm not saying this is a perfect photo, but it's a starting point. There was definitely a time when I was just reacting and changing settings until I found an acceptable exposure without really understanding how. So what I want to show you is how to go beyond just finding a decent exposure. It's understanding how to adjust that image with your camera settings to get the look that you want. We know that shutter speed, aperture, and ISO are all ways to adjust the exposure level in your photos. Flash adds another factor. By adjusting the power output of the flash, we vary the amount of light we're adding into the scene, and when that flash is pointed at a subject, we can affect how that subject is exposed. But the power output level of the flash is just one setting. The basic camera parameters still have critical roles, and we're going to talk about those now. When we use flash, aperture affects both the ambient light and the level of light from the flash in your photo. In these examples, as we narrow down the aperture from f2.8 to f10, with all other settings being consistent and the flash at 1/8 power, everything gets darker, including the exposure from flash. The subject exposure and ambient exposure stay proportional throughout the aperture range. When we stack these images, we can see that the flash is getting darker and the background is getting darker in equal measure. ISO also affects both the ambient light and the level of light from the flash in your photo. In these examples, as we reduce the ISO from 640 down to 64, with all other settings being consistent and the flash at 1/4 power, everything gets darker, including the exposure from the flash. The subject started out overexposed compared to the background, but at the end, the balance of flash and ambient stayed even throughout the ISO range. ISO and aperture are both proportional. Open up the aperture or raise the ISO, and it lets in more ambient light as well as more light from the flash. Shutter speed is different. Adjusting the shutter speed will not have an effect on flash in your photo because the flash fires in less than 1,000th of a second. So if your shutter speed is at 1/200th or 1/50th of a second, both exposures will receive the same amount of light from the flash. In these examples, as we reduce the shutter speed from 1/20th down to 1/250th of a second, with all other settings being consistent and the flash at 1/4 power, the subject lit by the flash stays brightly lit but the background, which is lit by ambient light, drops away. When we stack them, you can really see that change in background and see how the subject lit by the flash maintains a mostly consistent exposure. If we stack them going the other way, it's the same story. The car is still receiving some ambient light, so the car gets darker as that ambient light drops away. But you can see how effectively we are able to separate the subject and the background and play with that relationship. Not to mention, this was shot in daylight, and only through shutter speed we made it look like nighttime. So that also shows how powerful the shutter speed can be at changing the look of the scene. Lastly, we have the power output of the flash itself. As you can guess, raising the power of the flash will not affect the ambient light and only increases the exposure from the flash on the subject. In these examples, as we reduce the flash power from full power 1/1 to 1/64, with all other settings being consistent, the subject gets darker, but there's no effect on the ambient light or the background. Power output is an important factor to adjust during your shoot. It's the simplest to understand. More power equals more light, but once you're at full power, that's all you've got. So it's helpful to understand what the settings do to be more effective at lighting your scene and subject. By understanding how to adjust the camera parameters with flash, you are creatively deciding the look of your image, rather than just trying to land on an acceptable exposure. Being able to do this is helpful when you have too much or too little ambient light and you need to adapt for your situation. These are the basics, but once I understood off-camera flash techniques, it felt like a 2 + 2 = 5 moment for me. You can create an image in the camera that looks completely different from what you see with your eyes. And to me, that still feels like magic. Once I had finished getting these straightforward shots, I messed around and dropped the shutter really low, dropped everything way down, started playing with the slow shutter and moving the camera to get some weird light trail stuff in camera. When you combine a relatively long exposure with movement with flash, a flash freezes whatever it's lighting like an imprint in the frame amongst all that blurry stuff. And that could be a lot of fun. And then using your knowledge of ISO and aperture and power output, you can decide how dominant the blurry stuff is compared to the sharp part of the image from the flash in the photo. There is no limit to what you can do and what ideas you might have, but the first step is understanding how it works. I tried to keep this pretty simple and scientific. My impulse is usually to adjust and tweak multiple settings on the fly as I'm going, so it was unnatural for me to go through each setting in such a regimented way and take notes of everything as I was doing it, so I hope this is helpful. Thank you for watching. If you have any more questions or suggestions, let me know in the comments below, and I will see you next time.